Hi there. Now we want to talk about Chapter 16, Basic Residential Construction. This will be a really quick lecture. It's a very short and simple chapter. However, there are some test questions that pop up from time to time about it, so I want to make sure that you have been familiarized with it and you don't minimize it when you go through your studying. But again, going to be very quick. If you notice, there are very, very few slides associated with the chapter, and it's a really quick chapter in the book, so this shouldn't take us too very long to go through. It'll be a very quick and easy one for you. When you're dealing with residential construction, the first key is to know the difference between the types and styles of properties that you could come into contact with. And those are primarily ranch-style houses, which are single-level homes, two-story houses, and the two-story house has the same amount, or roughly the same amount, of square footage on the second floor as it does the first. Split-level homes, and a split-level home is a type of home where you would find where the entry is sort of between the two levels. And then, of course, contemporary homes, which could have even a different configuration than any of the above. There are some basic definitions, and this is really where you have to do a little bit of studying in this chapter. The things that we're going to point out in the next couple slides are going to be those things that are going to be important for you to know the definitions of. First of all, footings. The footing is the lowest part of the construction on a piece of property. And so when you talk about footings, what you're really talking about are the thing that the foundation itself rests on. So these are going to be below ground. Footings are always below ground. If you think of your feet as the lowest part of your body, a building is no different. The footing is the lowest part of the building. It just happens to be below ground. And how far below ground is really determined by the area of the country and the weather you experience. The colder the area you're in, the colder those, the lower or deeper into the ground those footings have to be poured in order to keep them from freezing. And we want to have them deep enough so that they don't freeze. Now, your foundation wall, in your book on page 378, the foundation wall is going to rest on top of the footings. And it's going to be, again, some type of concrete, brick, cinder block, some kind of a masonry wall that sits on top of the footings and comes up out of the ground. Remember, footings are below ground, so the foundation walls are going to come up out of the ground. That's where we first get above ground. Now, depending on the type of foundation you have, there may also be something called piers underneath the house. If you have what's called a crawl space type foundation, then you're going to also have piers under the house. And that is designed to support the floors between the foundation walls. Okay? So footings, foundation walls, and piers are the three terms you need to be familiar with as far as your foundation goes. Now, there are three main types of foundations that you find in North Carolina. The most common by far is the crawl space. Crawl space is easily recognizable when you approach the home because there are going to be stairs that go up to the front door, and the area underneath the house is not going to be accessible and or finished in any way. It's not sized for someone to walk into. There's not a floor down underneath the house. That would be a sign of a basement. If you go up to a house and it has an underneath area that obviously you can walk in and you can enter, that's considered a basement foundation, whereas a crawl space is going to be smaller than that. But in both cases, you're going to have to take steps up to the front door. In other words, the living area is elevated above ground level. Whereas with a concrete slab, the last one we have here on the bottom, the concrete slab is going to be a method of construction where the living area is level with ground. And so it's easy to recognize a concrete slab foundation when you approach the home because usually there are no stairs up into the house or maybe a half step or something like that, but the home itself is not raised above ground level. In a concrete slab, things to remember as far as your clients go. The plumbing, the electrical, all those things are going to be poured into the slab itself when the concrete is poured, which means they're not going to be movable. You're not going to be able to get under the house to inspect all those things because there is no under the house. It's just a solid piece of concrete that's been poured with all your utilities inside it. So from that perspective, generally concrete slabs are not preferable. Most people prefer to have either a basement or a crawl space from a maintenance perspective and just a usability perspective. However, concrete slabs are the cheapest of the three construction methods, so they are fairly popular in North Carolina. If you had to rank these as far as most popular or least popular, your crawl space would by far be the most popular, and your basement by far the least popular. So crawl space, then concrete slab, then basement, if you were ranking them as far as popularity. There is a mention on page 378 in your textbook about termites, and there, in my career in real estate in North Carolina, I've always told students that there are three types of houses when it comes to termites. There are houses that have termites, there are houses that have had termites, and there are houses that will have termites. It is simply inescapable if your home is in North Carolina that eventually you will have some type of a termite issue. That doesn't mean your house is going to fall down and crumble around you. Dealing with termites is simply a matter of inspecting, and when you find them, get rid of them early on before they have a chance to do a lot of damage. So there definitely are going to be times when you have inspections on properties, and we usually don't call it a termite inspection anymore. We call it a wood-destroying insect inspection, and you're going to find them. They are attracted to humid environments. They love pine wood, which is what most homes are built out of in North Carolina, and obviously we have humid environments, and the more moisture is present, the more likely you are to find termites. Some keywords or things that you need to be able to recognize on page 379 as far as the framing of the home goes. All of these words that are highlighted here are ones that are sort of fair game for them to throw at you on a state exam. Ones that are popular, the sill. The sill, or sometimes referred to as a sill plate, is the lowest piece of wood in the home. So if we back up and you think about, okay, we've got these footings with the foundation wall sitting on top of it. Well, at some point, we have to make a change from concrete or brick to wood. And that's the sill plate. So the sill is the first piece of wood that sits on top of the foundation wall. Now, from there and sort of building up, you have first your floor joists, and the floor joists are what sit on top of your sill. So these are going to be the basic support structure for your floors. You may also have girders underneath the floor, and these are going to be designed to support the floor between your piers. The girders sit on top of your piers, which are concrete structures or brick structures underneath the crawl space or inside the crawl space underneath the house between the foundation walls, and your girders sit on top of those. On top of all that, on top of your floor joists and your girders, you have your subfloor, and that's the piece of plywood that you actually walk on when you're walking across the floor. That's the thing that creates a level and walkable surface inside the home. Keywords as far as framing goes for walls, you should definitely know what studs are. Studs are the primary framing pieces of wood inside the walls. They run vertically inside the walls from floor to ceiling, and they provide structural support for the walls. Your sheetrock hangs on the studs, for example, and your siding on the outside of the house hangs on the studs. Don't worry too much about sole and top plates. I've never seen that tested before. However, you should be aware of what a header is. Headers are at the top of any cut in the wall. If you think of your studs as having your framing support, your structural support for the wall, well, there are times when we need to put holes in walls, like doors and windows. When we put doors and windows into our walls, we create a structural weakness there because there's nothing to provide that strength. There's nothing to hold the weight of the roof that's coming down over that door or window. And if you didn't do anything, if you just cut a hole there and stuck a door or window, and eventually that would crack, or maybe not collapse, but your door wouldn't work right, your window wouldn't move correctly, it would stick, it would jam, it would crack, it would do all kinds of things that we don't want it to do. So we put headers above all of our doors and windows to sort of distribute that load and make it more sturdy. And so your headers run across the top of your doors and windows. Okay. As far as your roof goes, key terminology for the roof, you should know what your ceiling joists are. Your ceiling joists are going to sit level if you're inside the house. Those are the things that create your flat ceiling if you're inside the house. Now, you also have something called rafters. The rafters are the things, and these attach to your ceiling joists, but these are the things that give your roof slope. The things that are angled that create the slope of your roof. And obviously it's very important to have some slope to your roof, because if you didn't, you wouldn't have a watertight roof. It would leak. We need that slope to help water run off, and snow and debris and all those kinds of things. So you have the ceiling joists, which create the flat and level surface of your ceiling inside the house. But then you also have the rafters, which are angled and give slope to the roof on the outside. The highest piece of wood in any home is called the ridge board. So that's an important one that maybe you might be tested on. The ridge board is the highest piece of wood in any home. As far as the last bullet point there, the eaves, soffit, freezeboard, and fascia, these are all things under the eave of the house. If you think about a roof, and if you're staring at the house from the front of the house, the overhang of the roof is called the eave. Whenever you have that overhang, and roofs normally overhang the front of a home, and usually the sides as well, that's called the eave. And so those terms are all associated with the eaves. And that's really about all you need to know about those particular terms. Okay. They do give you some good diagrams on page 380 and page 381. If you're more curious about some of those terms and you didn't understand from my descriptions what they were, take a look at those diagrams. There's also a more detailed one on page 383 in your book as well. Okay. So really this chapter boils down to learning some of these terminology pieces just so you can answer a quick question, and most of those are going to be the terms that are on page 378 and 379. A couple of other things that you might come into contact with, this idea of insulation here. Insulation, and it's on page 384 in your textbook. There are codes that come into play of how much insulation has to be installed in a particular property, and those are measured in something called an R value. If you look on page 385 in your textbook, it introduces the idea of an R value to you. And R value is just a way of measuring the effectiveness of insulation in a particular area. And they do ask that you know the minimum North Carolina building code for R value in properties. You need to know the minimum North Carolina building code for R value, and it's on page 385. It says North Carolina building codes require R19 insulation in floors, R13 in walls, and R30 in ceilings. So again, R19 in the floors, R13 in the walls, and R30 and the ceilings. You don't necessarily need to know what those numbers mean. You just need to know that those are the minimum levels. On the bottom of page 385, it makes mention of HVAC systems. That stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. If you had never figured that out in your previous existence, HVAC stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. You don't need to know anything else about HVAC. Don't worry about BTUs, but that is the unit that's used to measure the efficiency of or output of HVAC systems. On page 386, they make a mention of building codes. And there are only a couple things that you really need to understand about the building codes in North Carolina. Number one, you cannot do any work on real property in North Carolina without first obtaining a permit for that work. You need a permit before you can begin work. Again, you need a permit before you can begin the work. Once you finish the work and you've had the work inspected by the proper authorities, they're going to issue you this certificate of occupancy. Certificate of occupancy. And that is just proof that you have complied with the building codes in North Carolina. There are HUD minimum guidelines. HUD stands for Housing and Urban Development. There are minimum guidelines from HUD for building codes that are used with FHA and VA loans, etc. And remember, HUD also has minimum guidelines for manufactured houses. However, North Carolina's building code is more strict than the HUD minimums, and each city, county, municipality can have their own building code, which is more strict than the minimum North Carolina building code. And so you'll find different codes in Cary and Raleigh and Wake Forest, for example. Last thing in this chapter, and I told you it was a very quick chapter, last thing in this chapter is on page 387. In North Carolina, if you do work for someone else that is going to cost more than $30,000, you do need a general contractor's license. So again, if you're doing work for somebody else that's going to cost more than $30,000 and you're charging them for that work, you do need a general contractor's license in North Carolina. That is it for chapter 16. Very quick, short, sweet. You shouldn't spend a whole lot of time studying, but do make sure you study those terms so that you get those questions, because those are the gimmies, those are the easy ones. Thanks.